Today we're talking about plants. We've already begun our discussion of plants, and we talked about their evolution. We talked about them leaving the water, coming out on land, and then really thriving on land. They were able to do that due to their alternation of generations, going from that diploid state to a haploid state where they produced identical haploids that were able to spread all around and create new plants. Today, though, we're going into much more detail about the different types of plants and how they've adapted to their specific environmental niche. Plants that we know of that produce seeds are called spermatophytes. Most of the plants that you see out here, that you see around you, are spermatophytes. I mean, the ones that we talked about last time, the bryophytes, nah, not them. They make spores. But these spermatophytes produce seeds. This is a dandelion. They make a lot of seeds. Perhaps at some point in your life, you picked one of these and you said, I'm going to make a wish, and you blew on it. And then the dandelion seeds went, 15, 20 feet, landed in your yard, and made more dandelions. Do you recall doing that? Yeah, your parents love you. I always had my kids, back where I used to live, it was, they would pick those, and I was like, you need to go to the edge of the property and blow them as hard as you can into the neighbor's yard. And everyone thought it was cute, and only I knew I was setting a trap. Broadly speaking, there are two types of spermatophytes. There's angiosperms, and there are gymnosperms. The angiosperms are the flowering plants, the fruiting plants. The gymnosperms all have these exposed seeds. So when you think of angiosperms, think of anything that makes a flower, anything that makes a fruit. Gymnosperms, anything that makes a cone. I want to go into gymnosperms first. Gymnosperms evolved earliest anyway, so let's talk about them. They produce exposed seeds rather than seeds encased in fruit. You've all seen a pine cone before, right? And you've probably looked at them and thought, oh, they're baby pine cones and adult pine cones and such. We're going to get into what your misconceptions are. But if you look at the pine cone, you were to pick off a scale of a pine cone, those individual sort of leaf-looking things on it. You'll notice that there's the scale, and then at the bottom there are seeds. And those seeds are totally exposed to the environment. The only thing protecting them is that scale structure. There's no fruit. So gymnosperms are represented by cycads, conifers. You've seen Christmas trees, evergreens. They've been around for a long time. They reached their peak in the Mesozoic era. So I'm not sure if you guys have seen, of course you've seen movies with dinosaurs in them, right? What kind of trees do dinosaurs walk through in those movies?
Kind of thing.
Right, you never see them walking through pine trees. They're always looking through these broad-leaved, tropical-looking trees, right? Truth is, though, mainly pines, mainly conifers.
So you're saying they're really long,
Oh, we'll get into just, okay, so you're asking about the dinosaurs with the long necks reaching up and eating pine cones. We're going to talk about dinosaur necks and how they weren't actually used to get to the top of the tree in the next lecture. Yeah, that's a misunderstanding. Actually, sidebar, let's talk quickly about long-necked dinosaurs because Nicole was interested. If you were to look at the a dinosaur's neck and their tail, all right, and this will be on the next exam, so don't worry, I'm not wasting time here. If you have a dinosaur's neck and a tail, let's say Diplodocus or Brachiosaur, one of the large sauropods, the four-legged ones, right? Big long tail, big long neck. So if you were to lift your neck up, if you're that dinosaur, it's going to be really hard to pump blood up to the brain. Think about, okay, what is the animal with the longest neck that we know of now? Giraffe. The only way the giraffe can have a neck as long as it is because it's, the muscles around its neck act almost like a pressure cuff. So they help pump the blood up. Dinosaurs didn't have those muscle attachments. So they could not pump the blood up to the top of their neck. Does that make sense? Do you follow me on that? So the idea is, likely they weren't reaching their neck up their necks were straight out or lower than their heart in order to allow blood to flow. So then the question becomes, immediately, then why'd they have such a long neck? Here, I'm going to let you guys think about this because this is kind of cool. And this is our most recent thought on why they had these long necks. And by our, I mean like the scientific consensus. You have a really, really long neck as a balance. Because what else is really long? The tail is really long. And what was the tail used for? Defense and balance. So your tail's kept off the ground, and if the tail whips this way, this multi-ton tail's going that way, you need a counterbalance on the other side. That just feels wrong? Yeah. But that's the way they could defend themselves. The Diplodocus, for instance, could actually get their tail to whip and break the speed of sound. So it would crack. Yeah. Based on, again, that's based on physics modeling. So that's the reason that these, well, one of the reasons that these dinosaurs had these very long necks. Another thing you're going to really hate? Sorry. You know, aquatic reptiles like the plesiosaur and such, you always have these images of them like reaching their necks out of the water and grabbing things. They couldn't do that. They weren't able to. They didn't have the muscular attachments. So that's a preview of the next lecture where we talk about history of the Earth and how organisms evolved. I know, we're coming to it. 3-ish hours. But gymnosperms, so we have fossilized remains going farther back beyond the Mesozoic. They reached their peak then, because it was during the Mesozoic where you start to see early flowering plants. So conifers have been around for about 300 million years in their current form. And they produce cones, these exposed seeds, and you've seen them. I mean, these big things are all over the place right now, right? But you've probably also seen these teeny tiny little cones, right? Have you seen those? So if you look on the edges of the branches, you're going to see these tiny little cones. Oftentimes, people mistake these little cones for baby pine cones. They're not. This is the female. This is the male. So you've got eggs and sperm. The little ones produce sperm, and they're on the edges of the plants. Why are they on the edge of the plant? It's not about falling. What do they produce if they're males? They're producing pollen. You're farther out, so what can catch that pollen? Bees. Wind. Bees too, I guess. But I never see bees sort of like, I'm going to go and check out that cone. By accident. It's a blind bee. Can't. Maybe it's just a really ugly flower. Okay, it could work. You know what? I'll give you that. It is possible in the realm of possibilities. Conifers are super well adapted to the cold. Let's think about this. So first off, that cone shape. Conifers, cones, right? They're shaped like a cone in order to shed snow. Your roof on your house is usually triangular, so that when weather hits it, it goes off the edges instead of sits on it. I'm not sure, there are some department stores that have flat roofs. So when it snows heavily, those roofs collapse. That would be the equivalent of what happens with other trees. You see, what are those called? Other types of hardwoods losing their leaves during the fall. So that in the winter, when it snows, snow doesn't pile up on those leaves and break the branches. Those trees tend to have a flatter top compared to these nice cone-shaped conifers. The scale, or the needle, has a very, very reduced shape. It doesn't have a lot of exposed surface area, so it doesn't get cold fast. In fact, if you were to take a scalpel and slice it down a scale, it's effectively a leaf that's rolled up really tightly. That traps a little bit of air on the inside, which is an insulating barrier. And most of the scales remain green for more than a year. And they don't shed all at once. There's this misconception that these trees never shed their scales. But if you've ever had a conifer in your house or around, you know there's scales everywhere. It's just they replace them. So conifers are very well adapted to the cold. Those are our gymnosperms, exposed seed plants. We also have angiosperms. Angiosperms produce flowers and fruit, covered seeds. We're going to go through in depth how this happens. This is a super interesting reproductive cycle. The flower of the angiosperm are a set of adapted leaves that help in pollination. They attract bees, unlike, cones. They've got a lot of things going for them, what makes them attractive. Colors, of course, but if you were to look, bees, us, and different animals all have varying abilities to see wavelengths of light. When a bee looks at a flower, they don't see just one color. They're going to see multiple permutations based on different pigments that they can see, but we can't. So flowers in the world looks entirely different to insects than to us. We start off the angiosperm in its smallest state as the seedling. And where does the seedling come from? What? I'm not trying to trick you guys. A seed, thanks. I mean,
I was waiting for the I'm not trying to trick you part.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm really not. Seedlings come from seeds. They develop from the embryos inside the seed. The seed itself has this nice seed coat surrounding it, a cotyledon, which is filled with delicious, delicious fats and sugars, and then your embryo. The embryo has a root radicle, a little premature stem called a hypocotyl, and very, very simple plumes. So all the cotyledon, the embryo are wrapped up in seed coat. The seed coat's there to protect the plant. It protects that embryo. It's waxy. Why is it waxy? Sort of. Yeah, it's more, you're right. It's all about protection, but it also keeps the water on the inside. Without that seed coat, seeds would dry out and they'd become inviable. They wouldn't live very, very fast. Some seeds can exist for years and years and years without any water because of that seed coat holding in moisture, and they go into a state called dormancy. They just stay quiet. They don't sprout. Heck, some seeds actually require a fire in order to remove some of the seed coat so that they can start to sprout. When the conditions are just right, you've got warmth, you've got some moisture, you got plenty of oxygen, the root radicle emerges. That's the first part that always comes out of the seed. It's a little root. And a root's job is to take up nutrients and water. So the plant is starting to grow using up the fats and the sugars in the cotyledon. And it's supplementing that from the root. Following the root radicle emerging, the plant begins to put up a shoot. It begins to push the rest of the seed up, and then the cotyledons emerge. Fruits are the structures that contain seeds, and they're really useful to help in distribution. Now, you guys all know fruits. Give me an example of a fruit. A strawberry. Strawberry has its seeds on the outside. It's an aggregate fruit. A tomato. Okay, so fun story about tomatoes and such. You guys have all been into, at least at some point in your life, probably gotten to the argument, is tomato a fruit or a vegetable? Here's the deal. I was with a bunch of plant scientists. Literally, we're having a lab meeting, and we got into an argument over this for an hour and a half. And it comes down to fruits and vegetables are human concepts. Plant kingdom doesn't care. Does that make sense? There's no distinct delineation more than what we as a society put on these definitions. Some people are like, well, if it's got fruit on the inside, it's a fruit. If that's your definition, then obviously a tomato is a fruit. So is a lemon. So is, any other type of plant that has seeds on the inside. So it all depends on your definitions. It's right back to freaking taxonomy. So there we go. If you want it to be a fruit, it'll be a fruit. Yep, that's what it is. Because we're humans, and we control the world. Okay, tomato, apples, think about the shape of these. Basically, what shape are they? Round. Why? They fall off a tree, and they roll away. Because if you're producing an offspring, you don't want it to live next to you or with you for the rest of their lives. Plants will do that. They take root, and then they start to grow, and then they compete for resources. You want it taken away. How else might they be good for distribution? Yeah, animals like to eat this stuff. Animals eat, let's say, berries. Let's talk about mulberries, right? Do you guys know what a mulberry is? Small, it's a berry that birds will eat and then fly somewhere and excrete purple on whatever they excrete purple on. Okay? Birds eat blackberries. Birds eat all sorts of seeds. They get them, they fly somewhere, and the seeds drop. It's kind of interesting. Let's talk about blackberries. Have you guys eaten blackberries before? All right, so there are exactly two kinds of blackberries. Two kinds of blackberries. There is super sweet and delicious, and there's horribly bitter, and there's nothing in between. You guys notice that? Okay, you're eating a package of blackberries, you eat one that's super sweet and good. You're like, great, that was delicious, I'm going to have another. You eat the next one, it's super bitter, and you're like, well, the next one I eat definitely won't be bitter. And then you eat that, and the process goes on. They're super bitter at some points to prevent organisms from wanting to eat them while they are not ripe, while the seed is not ready. Once the seed becomes ready, the fruit ripens to produce a lot of sugar so that animals are enticed to eat it. So that they'll eat it and then take the seed away, and then they excrete the seed in a nice little pile of fertilizer. And their stomach acid has removed some of the seed coat so the seed can sprout easier. These fruits are ultimately developed to help spread the plant itself. And when you think about it, at its base level, fruits are really just sugar-filled ovaries. And that just drives me nuts, because what's happened is the egg gets fertilized in the ovary, and then it grows bigger and bigger and bigger, filling up with more and more glucose to entice organisms to eat them. So plants start off as a seed, and then they begin to grow. And they have two types of growth: vegetative growth and reproductive growth. Vegetative growth is where the plant undergoes rapid rounds of mitosis to get taller and taller and taller. Reproductive growth is where the reproductive structures, and angiosperms, the flowers, and gymnosperms, the cones, begin to develop. So with vegetative growth, you're increasing the size of the root system, and you're increasing the size of the shoot system. You're getting bigger. It's the vascular cambium, if you guys remember the lab we did. The vascular cambium is what gives rise to the primary vascular tissues. That is, this is what produces the vascular tissue. What are the two vascular tissues we talked about? Xylem and phloem. They're both tracheids. They have these little holes throughout them. They're long tubes that go through the plant. That's produced by the cambium right here. And you'll see the phloem is on one side, on the other is going to be the xylem. As long as conditions are good, most plants have what's called indeterminate growth. That is, they will grow and grow and grow. These are vascular plants. They'll keep growing as long as conditions are right. They don't have a maximum limit except those set by physics. That's different than you and I. We will grow and grow right up to a point, and then our genetics say, okay, stop now. Some of us stop earlier than others. Does that make sense? If you don't stop growing, you keep going forever. Orson Scott Card writes a book about you. It's terrible. So you just keep, if you didn't stop growing, I don't know, by the time you're 40, if you last that long because your heart would give out, you'd be probably like 15 feet tall. Other plants have determinate growth, like we talked about, bryophytes have that. There's a set point where they cannot grow any larger. Genetically, they have an upper limit. We have determinate growth. We have a genetic upper limit to our size. Most plants do not, which allows you to have these towering plants. I was driving down the road the other day, and I was in town, and I'd never seen, I was not in town, I was just like, oh shoot, where was it? Because it just drove me nuts. I'm driving along, and there was, you know, a forest off to the left side of the road, and sticking out of this forest, like twice as tall as any other tree, was one tree. It's like, how did that one tree grow twice as big as all the rest? So I'm looking at this, and I kept thinking, is it an artificial tree? Did somebody put up something that looks like a tree, but it's not? I wish I took a picture of it, because that's an example. Do you, I don't.
So,
okay, go on.
apparently, so phone companies, well, I know there's like one down in Radius.
That might be where I was. Yeah, so phone companies apparently will disguise, it might have been a cell phone tower disguised as a tree. And I was sitting there looking at it, I was like, is it a what is going on with that one tree? But it really didn't look like all the rest. If it was a phone tower, that makes so much more sense than a tree that happened to grow twice as tall as all the other trees around it. It really stood out. So if that was a phone tower, then they did a terrible job disguising it. Although good enough to fool me into thinking it was a tree that was just twice as big as any other instead of, you know, the obvious.
Yeah, I think they're more on the tree, so it's not as bad to see.
Angiosperms have two broad classifications. So we've got spermatophytes split into gymnosperms and angiosperms. Now we got angiosperms splitting into monocotyledonous plants and dicotyledonous plants, otherwise known as monocots and eudicots or monocots and dicots. I will accept any of those descriptions. A monocot, monocotyledonous plant. Mono means what? One. They have one cotyledon. Eudicots, or dicotyledonous plants. They have di. What does di mean? Two. So two cotyledons. Cotyledon is just those early primitive leaves. So you've got monocots and dicots. Monocots. If I was to hypothetically, maybe sometime in the future, give you a plant and say, hey, figure out whether this is a monocot or a dicot, you could look at it and say, well, how many cotyledons are in the seed? Split it open. If you see two cotyledons, it's a dicot. If you see one cotyledon, it's a monocot. The root of a monocot has the xylem and a phloem in a ring, whereas the stems have the xylem and phloem spread throughout. The most telling feature, though, and the easiest to identify, is the leaf veins. In monocots, those leaf veins are parallel. There has been some point in your life, because you are a normal human, where you were bored out of your mind, and the only thing around you was blades of grass. And you picked up a blade of grass and peeled it apart bit by bit. The reason you're able to peel it apart is because the leaf veins are in parallel. That means it's a monocotyledonous plant. And flower parts are in multiples of threes, so you can count, she loves me not. Which is hilarious, because you can actually predict how that's going to end up if you understand monocots and dicots. I mean, you don't get to do much with it, because you're really just playing against yourself, but. As far as the dicot goes, a eudicot or a dicotyledonous plant, you've got two cotyledons. The root phloem is between the arms of the xylem. So if you look here, you got a star in the middle, and then the xylem the xylem are expanding out, and the phloem are these rings in between the xylem. The vascular bundles form a very distinct ring. If you ever looked at, what's it called? Celery. So celery there's a stupid experiment you probably did when you were younger. It's not a stupid experiment. All experiments you were cool. Where you took celery and you put it into like different colored dyes. Did you ever do that? You would see the dyes uptaken in a ring shape through that stalk because of the vascular bundles. The leaves form a net pattern. So they're not parallel anymore. They have a central vein and then shoots coming off of that. In the flower parts are in 4s and 5s. What you get to when you get 12 and 15, well, you're doomed there because of lowest common denominator. So you got monocots and you got dicots. You'll have to identify a few samples of them, and I wouldn't be surprised if you have to tell me, I don't know, 2 of these properties. The 2 properties I would remember are based in the name and the leaves.